My husband wanted me to sell my grandmother's old shack, but the moment I uncovered a hidden vault, I realized her life was a dangerous royal secret, and I'd just stepped into a century-old hunt for it. Just sell it, Clara. Mark didn't even look up from his laptop, the blue light reflecting off his glasses, making him look like a stranger in our own living room. Seriously, it's a money pit. The property taxes alone are bleeding us dry. He finally glanced at me, his expression a carefully constructed mask of practicality, but I could see the impatience simmering underneath. It's an old shack. Let it go. An old shack. That's what he called my grandmother's house, the place where I spent every summer of my childhood, where the scent of lavender and old books still clung to the floral wallpaper like a gentle ghost. The house wasn't a shack. It was a time capsule. It was the only tangible piece of her I had left. My throat tightened. Mark, we've been over this. It was her home. It's important to me. What's more important, Clara? A rotting house an hour away that we visit twice a year, or our future? That sure thing tech stock I told you about is about to pop. The money from the sale would set us up. A new car, a real vacation, not another weekend camping trip. Think about it. He made it sound so simple, so logical. He was always the numbers guy, the pragmatist. I was the sentimental one, the dreamer, a flaw he'd once found charming, but now seemed to view as a liability. The arguments had been escalating for months. Every time a credit card bill arrived, every time the car made a funny noise, the conversation circled back to the shack. He called my attachment to it a hoarder's legacy, a phrase that felt like a physical slap. My grandmother Elena had been many things, a refugee who fled a war-torn country with nothing but the clothes on her back, a woman with a spine of steel and eyes that held a universe of untold stories. But she was not a hoarder. She was careful. She was a keeper of things. Defeated, I sighed. The fight was draining me more than the financial strain. Fine, I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. I'll go out there this weekend. I'll start clearing it out. Get it ready for a realtor. A slow smile spread across Mark's face, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. That's my girl. Be ruthless, okay? Don't get bogged down in old photo albums. Just box it, tag it, and get it ready for the dump. He turned back to his screen, the conversation and my feelings summarily dismissed. That Saturday, I drove out alone. The city skyline faded in my rear-view mirror, replaced by rolling hills and familiar country roads. With every mile, the knot of dread in my stomach loosened, replaced by a bitter-sweet nostalgia. Turning onto the gravel driveway felt like coming home. The house stood exactly as I remembered it. A little two-story cottage with peeling white paint and dark green shutters, almost completely swallowed by my grandmother's wildly overgrown rose bushes and wisteria vines. It looked tired, neglected, and beautiful. It looked like her. The old brass key, heavy and ornate, turned in the lock with a familiar, satisfying clunk. The air that greeted me was cool and still, thick with the scent of my childhood. I ran a hand along the dusty mahogany sideboard in the entryway, my fingers tracing the familiar nicks and scratches. This was where she kept a bowl of hard candies. I could almost hear her voice, a low melodic hum with the faint trace of an accent she never spoke about, telling me, "Just one little starling before you spoil your dinner." I spent the morning in a haze, drifting from room to room. I opened her wardrobe and buried my face in a wool coat that still smelled faintly of her rosewater perfume. I sat on the lumpy armchair by the window where she'd taught me to read, her finger guiding mine across the pages of fairy tales about deposed princes and clever peasant girls who outsmarted dragons. She loved those stories. She always said there was more truth in fairy tales than in newspapers. By the afternoon, I forced myself to start the grim task Mark had assigned. I began in the small downstairs study, a room crammed with bookshelves and stacked with boxes of papers and photographs. Mark was right about one thing. It was overwhelming. But as I sorted, I wasn't just seeing junk. I was seeing a life. Receipts from the 1950s, letters in a language I couldn't read, photos of stern-faced relatives in front of buildings that looked like they belonged in a history book. My grandmother was a private woman. She'd deflected my childhood questions about her past with fantastical stories. She'd say she came from a land of ice and snow, that her family had once talked to wolves, that they'd lost their home to a great fire set by a jealous king. It was all make-believe, I knew, but a part of me always wondered. The last major piece of furniture in the room was a monstrously heavy oak wardrobe shoved into a corner. It had been there for as long as I could remember. My grandmother had a peculiar rule about it. It was never, ever to be moved. She'd once told me it was holding up a weak part of the wall, and I never questioned it. Mark had always complained about it, calling it an eyesore that took up a third of the room. "First thing to go when we sell," he'd declared. A small spark of defiance lit inside me. I wasn't going to sell, not yet. But I was going to move the wardrobe. I needed to see what was behind it. I needed to know if her story was just another fairy tale. It took me the better part of an hour, using old blankets to slide it across the worn wooden floor. My muscles screamed in protest, and the wardrobe groaned like an old beast being woken from a century of sleep. Finally, with one last grunt-filled shove, it was a few feet away from the wall. I was panting, my hands on my knees, when I looked up at the space it had revealed. The wallpaper was the same faded floral pattern as the rest of the room, but my eyes caught something. A faint, almost invisible seam. It wasn't straight like a panel. It was the outline of a rectangular section of the wall, about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. I ran my fingers over it. The wallpaper felt different there, less bonded to the plaster underneath. My heart started to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pressed gently against the center of the rectangle. Nothing. I pressed harder, leaning my shoulder into it. There was a soft click, a sound so quiet I almost missed it. The section of the wall didn't swing open like a door. Instead, it sank inwards by an inch, with a gritty, scraping sound of stone on stone. A wave of cold, musty air washed over my face, smelling of deep earth and something else. Something metallic and ancient. My breath hitched. With trembling fingers, I hooked my nails into the top seam and pulled. The stone panel, heavier than I ever could have imagined, swung silently inward into a dark, waiting cavity. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to turn it on. I aimed the beam into the blackness, and the light caught the edge of something that wasn't stone or wood. It was dark velvet, faded and crumbling with age, lining the inside of a small, hidden vault. And resting on that velvet, winking back at me from the depths of the darkness, was the unmistakable, blinding glitter of gold and the deep, cold fire of 1,000 gemstones. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. My mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The beam from my phone shook, sending fractured rainbows dancing across the dusty floorboards. It had to be fake. It had to be my grandmother's eccentric collection of paste and glass, the kind of costume jewelry a theatrical woman might collect. But even in the dim light, the fire in the stones was too deep, the gleam of the gold too soft and heavy. This was no costume collection. My hand, seemingly with a will of its own, reached into the cold darkness of the vault. My fingers brushed against something solid, intricate, and cold. So cold it felt like ice. I carefully drew it out into the light. It was a necklace, but that word felt pitifully inadequate. A cascade of diamonds woven into a pattern of golden ivy leaves fell from a chain of enormous cornflower blue sapphires. It was heavier than I expected, resting in my palm with the profound weight of history. Dangling from the center was a small, exquisitely detailed crest, a 2-headed eagle clutching a scepter. My blood ran cold. I gently placed it on the floor beside me and reached back in. Next came a tiara, a delicate filigree of platinum and diamonds designed to look like a wreath of frost-covered blossoms. then brooches shaped like sunbursts, diamond-encrusted hairpins, a set of cufflinks made from Siberian emeralds, so dark they were almost black. Piece after piece, I pulled them from their velvet tomb, laying them out on the dusty floor of the study. They glowed with an inner light, a silent, magnificent testament to a world of unimaginable opulence. My grandmother's stories, her fairy tales, started echoing in my head. A land of ice and snow, a jealous king, lost our home to a great fire. I had always pictured a village, a small cottage. Not this. This wasn't from a cottage. This was from a palace. This was the treasure of a queen or a grand duchess. My grandmother, Elena, who taught me how to knead bread and darn socks, who wore faded floral aprons and hummed folk songs while she gardened. Who was she? A sharp, ugly thought pierced through my awe. Mark. I could practically hear his voice. We can finally pay off the mortgage. I'll call an auction house first thing Monday. That tech stock is waiting, Clara. He would see this treasure not as a key to my family's past, but as a pile of cash. He would strip it of its magic, its history, its soul, and convert it into numbers on a screen. The secret wasn't just my grandmother's anymore, it was mine to protect. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could not tell my husband. Not now, maybe not ever. The man who called this house a shack could never understand the legacy hidden within its walls. With trembling hands, I began to carefully place the jewels back inside the vault. They felt different now, charged with the weight of my decision. As I pushed the last brooch into its place, my fingers brushed against a small, stiff packet tucked deep into a corner, hidden behind a fold in the velvet lining. It was wrapped in oilskin and tied with a faded silk ribbon. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was different. This wasn't treasure. This was a message. I untied the brittle ribbon and carefully unfolded the oilskin. Inside was a small leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with age. A thin, tarnished silver clasp held it shut. I managed to pry it open. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping script in a language I recognized from her old letters but couldn't read. Russian, maybe? It looked like Cyrillic. But tucked just inside the front cover, facing the first page of inscrutable text, was a single faded photograph. It was a formal family portrait. A handsome man with a neatly trimmed beard and sad, dark eyes stood tall in a decorated military uniform. Beside him sat a woman who stole my breath away. It was my grandmother. She was younger, maybe only 20, but her posture was regal, her gaze direct and unflinching. She wore the sapphire and diamond necklace, and standing between them, her small hand resting on her mother's knee, was a little girl with wide, serious eyes and 2 dark braids. My world tilted on its axis. My grandmother had never spoken of a sister or any family other than the distant, stern-faced relatives in her photos. I stared at the face of the little girl, at the familiar shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her chin. And with a sickening, dizzying lurch, I realized I wasn't looking at a stranger. I was looking at my grandmother, Elena. This regal woman in the photograph wasn't her. It was her mother, my great-grandmother. My head spun with questions. Who were these people? What happened to them? Why did she run? Just as I traced the outline of my grandmother's tiny face in the photograph, a sound from outside shattered the tomb-like silence of the house. The distinct, unmistakable crunch of tires rolling slowly up the gravel driveway. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mark thought I'd be here all day. My phone hadn't rung. A car here now? It could only mean trouble. I shoved the photograph and the diary into my pocket, my mind screaming as I scrambled to push the heavy stone panel back into the wall, trying to erase a secret that had just changed my entire world. My hands flew to the stone panel, my muscles screaming in protest as I tried to force it shut. It was too heavy, too awkward. The sound of a car door slamming shut echoed through the quiet afternoon, jolting me like a physical blow. There was no time. I gave up on the vault and lunged for the wardrobe, pouring every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I had into shoving it back against the wall. It scraped and groaned, a horrible, deafening noise in the stillness. I managed to move it just enough to cover the secret door, leaving a gap of only a few inches on one side. It would have to do. I grabbed a dusty old book from a shelf, sank into the lumpy armchair, and tried to force my breathing to even out. My heart felt like it was trying to batter its way out of my chest. The diary and the photograph in my pocket felt like they were burning a hole through my jeans. I held the book upside down, my eyes fixed on the front door, waiting. The footsteps on the porch were heavy, deliberate. Then a sharp, authoritative knock, not Mark's impatient rap, not a friendly neighbor. I stayed silent, praying they'd think the house was empty and leave. The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the old door in its frame. Clara, I know you're in there. Your car is in the drive." The voice was deep, unfamiliar with a faint, unplaceable accent. A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty house traced its way down my spine. How did he know my name? I slowly rose, my legs feeling like lead, and crept toward the door. I peered through the peephole, a small, distorted circle of glass that my grandmother had installed years ago. A man stood on the porch. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed out of place in this rural setting. He looked to be in his late 60s with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes that were a startlingly pale gray. He was handsome, but there was a hardness to his features, a predatory stillness in the way he held himself. He didn't look like a realtor or a building inspector. He looked like something out of one of my grandmother's stories. Taking a shaky breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice coming out as a reedy whisper. The man's pale eyes scanned me from head to toe, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Recognition, disappointment. "You must be Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. "You have your grandmother's eyes." He offered a thin, polished smile that didn't touch those cold eyes. "My name is Alexei Volkov. I was a friend of your grandmother's, an old friend." The name meant nothing to me. My grandmother had friends from her church, from her gardening club, kind elderly ladies named Mildred and Betty. This man did not belong in that world. "I'm sorry," I said, my hand tightening on the edge of the door. "She never mentioned you." "Elena was a private woman," he said smoothly, his gaze drifting past me into the house. "She had many secrets. I heard through some old contacts that the house was being prepared for sale. I came to see if there was any mementos of hers that I might be able to purchase, for sentimental reasons, of course." The words were slick, practiced. He wasn't here for a dusty teapot or a chipped teacup. He was here for what was behind the wardrobe. The thought was so certain, so terrifying, that it almost buckled my knees. How could he possibly know? "The house isn't for sale yet," I said, trying to sound firm, "and her personal effects are for the family." Alexei's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Of course, but perhaps you might have found some of her older things from before she came to this country? Letters, perhaps, or jewelry?" He said the word so casually, but it hung in the air between us like a drawn sword. My blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, the words tasting clumsy and false. "She came here with nothing." This was the story she had always told, the foundation of my understanding of her. "Did she?" Alexei raised a silver eyebrow. He took a step closer, his presence seeming to fill the entire porch. "Elena was not a simple woman, Clara. She was born Princess Yelena Petrovna Yusupova, and she did not leave her home with nothing." Princess. The word hung in the air, unreal and absurd. Yelena Petrovna Yusupova. It sounded like a name from one of the fairy tales, but looking at this man, at the cold certainty in his eyes, I knew it wasn't a fairy tale. It was the truth. The photograph, the diary, the jewels. It all crashed down on me. My grandmother was royalty, a dispossessed, hidden princess. "I think you're mistaken," I managed to stammer. Alexei sighed, a sound of profound theatrical patience. Her family, my family. We were close. Our histories are entwined. There were certain heirlooms that were misplaced during the turmoil of the revolution. Heirlooms that belonged to my family by right. Your grandmother was merely their custodian. A sapphire necklace, for instance, a diamond tiara. Do these things sound familiar? My throat was so tight I couldn't speak. He knew. He knew exactly what was in the vault. He must have been searching for this for decades. He was looking at me now, but his pale eyes seemed to be looking right through me, through the walls of the house, directly at the wardrobe in the study. "I am a reasonable man," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "Those pieces have a far greater historical value than a monetary one. To the right collector, they are priceless. To a pawn shop, they are merely stones. I am prepared to be very generous, Clara, to save you the trouble of dealing with complications." It was a threat veiled in politeness. He was telling me that I was out of my depth, that I had stumbled into a world I couldn't possibly navigate. My mind was racing. I couldn't let him in. I couldn't let him see the wardrobe wasn't flush against the wall. "I have to ask you to leave," I said, my voice shaking but firm. I started to close the door. He put a hand flat against it, stopping it easily. His strength was surprising. "A mistake," he said softly, his pale eyes boring into mine. "You are making a very great mistake. Some legacies are more dangerous than you can imagine." He held my gaze for a long moment, then slowly withdrew his hand. "I will be in town for a few days, at the inn. Think about my generous offer. Think very carefully about what your grandmother would have wanted." He turned and walked back to his sleek black car without another word. I watched him drive away, my entire body trembling. I slammed the door shut, slid the deadbolt, and leaned against it, my legs finally giving out. A princess. My grandmother was a princess, and this man, this Alexei Volkov, was hunting for her treasure. As I slid to the floor, my hand went to the pocket with the diary. I suddenly knew, with chilling certainty, that whatever answers I needed, whatever danger I was in, the key was locked inside those cryptic Cyrillic pages. And then my phone buzzed in my other pocket. It was a text from Mark. "Realtor is chomping at the bit. He wants to do a walkthrough tomorrow. You cleared out that ugly old wardrobe yet?" Mark's text message felt like a splash of ice water. Tomorrow. The word pulsed in my mind, a frantic ticking clock. A realtor, here tomorrow. He'd want to see every room, measure every wall, poke into every corner. He'd see the wardrobe pulled away from the wall. He'd ask questions I couldn't answer. And Mark. Mark would be with him. Mark, with his practical, unsentimental eyes, would see the gap, the scuff marks on the floor. He'd push the wardrobe aside out of sheer curiosity, and then it would all be over. The vault, the jewels. The secret I was already beginning to feel was a sacred trust. It would all be exposed, appraised, and sold to the highest bidder. Alexei Volkov and his veiled threats would become the least of my problems. Panic gave way to a cold, sharp clarity. I couldn't let that happen. I had until tomorrow to figure this out. My gaze fell on the wardrobe. I had to secure the vault, but first I had to understand what I was protecting. I pulled the small leather diary from my pocket. The silver clasp glinted in the fading afternoon light. The Cyrillic script was a beautiful, impenetrable wall between me and my grandmother's past. I needed a translator, not just any translator, but someone I could trust. My mind reeled. Who could I possibly trust with a secret like this? A a secret about imperial jewels and a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a spy novel. Then, a name surfaced from the depths of my memory. Professor Anya Sharma. My favorite professor from college. She'd taught Russian history, a class I'd taken as an elective and had fallen in love with. She was brilliant, fiercely intelligent, and had a passion for the Romanov era. More importantly, she was discreet. She'd once helped a student navigate a deeply personal family issue involving old documents from the Soviet Union, and she'd handled it with the utmost sensitivity. She was retired now, but she still lived just a town over. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I took a dozen pictures of the diary's pages with my phone, my hands still shaking slightly. Then I faced the wardrobe. I couldn't move it back on my own, not completely, but I could disguise the gap. I spent the next hour dragging dusty furniture from other rooms, a rickety plant stand, a tall, thin coat rack, a stack of old hat boxes, and arranging them around the side of the wardrobe, making it look like a cluttered, intentional corner of forgotten things. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough to deflect a casual glance. Finally, I placed the sapphire necklace, the one from the photograph, the one that felt like the heart of the collection, into my handbag. It was a crazy risk, but I couldn't bear to leave it behind. It felt like proof, like a connection to the woman in the picture. I locked the house, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, and drove straight to Professor Sharma's address. It was a modest bungalow surrounded by a meticulously kept garden, a stark contrast to my grandmother's wild cottage. When she answered the door, she looked exactly the same, just with a few more fine lines around her sharp, intelligent eyes. "Clara Evans, my goodness, what a surprise," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "It's been years. Please come in, come in." Inside, her house smelled of tea and old paper, a scent I found immensely comforting. After a few minutes of pleasantries, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Professor," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I need your help. It's unusual, and it has to be completely confidential." Her expression grew serious. She nodded, gesturing for me to continue. I took a deep breath and told her everything. I started with my grandmother, the house, the pressure from my husband to sell. I told her about moving the wardrobe, finding the hidden vault. Her eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. Then I told her about Alexei Volkov. When I said the name, a flicker of recognition or perhaps alarm crossed her face. Finally, I showed her the photos of the diary on my phone, and taking another leap of faith, I pulled the sapphire necklace from my bag and laid it on the coffee table between us. The gasp that escaped Professor Sharma's lips was sharp and audible. She leaned forward, her academic curiosity replaced by sheer, unadulterated awe. She didn't touch it, but her eyes traced the lines of the golden ivy leaves, the facets of the enormous sapphires. "My God," she whispered, "the Yusupov sapphires. I've only ever seen them in grainy black and white photographs. They were thought to have been lost forever in 1918. "Yusupov?" I repeated, the name Alexei had used. "He said my grandmother was a princess." The Yusupovs were one of the wealthiest, most influential families in the Russian Empire, second only to the Romanovs themselves, she explained, her gaze still fixed on the necklace. Princess Zinaida Yusupova was a legendary beauty and a close confidant of the last Tsarina. This was one of her signature pieces. She finally looked up at me, her eyes shining with an intense light. "Clara, this isn't just jewelry. This is a lost piece of history, a dangerous piece of history." She swiped through the pictures of the diary on my phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The penmanship is exquisite," she murmured. "Yes, this is a diary. It appears to be from 1917, right through the revolution." She paused on the picture of the family portrait. "And this would be Princess Irina, Zinaida's daughter, and her husband, Prince Felix, the man who famously murdered Rasputin, and their daughter, also named Irina, but they called her Bebe. Her eyes darted from the little girl in the photo to my face. She has your eyes. My great-grandmother, the murderer's wife. My grandmother, the little girl. It was too much to absorb. What does it say? I urged, desperate. Professor Sharma spent the next hour translating, her voice a low murmur as she pieced together the story. The diary belonged to my great-grandmother, Irina. She wrote of chaos and fear as their world crumbled. She wrote of packing the jewels, sewing them into the linings of corsets and coats. She wrote of their harrowing escape from the Crimea on a British battleship. But then the entries became more sporadic, more desperate. She wrote from exile in Paris, of dwindling funds and shadowy figures who were hunting for their lost fortune. She wrote of her husband's guilt and paranoia, and of threats from both Bolshevik agents and royalist factions who believed the Yusupovs had betrayed the Tsar. The last entry was dated 1928. It was short, frantic. Professor Sharma read it aloud, her voice tight with tension. They have found us, Volkov's men. They are not after the jewels, not only. They are after the letters. They know Felix kept copies. I have given everything to Elena. I have told her to run, to forget her name, to forget us. She is all that is left. She is the only one who can keep the secret safe. Professor Sharma looked up from the phone, her face pale. Volkov's men. It must be the same family. They've been looking for this for a century. Letters? I asked, my mind reeling. What letters? There were no letters in the vault. I don't know, she admitted. But according to this, they're even more important than the jewels. She looked at me, her expression grim. Clara, this man Alexei isn't just a collector. Your grandmother wasn't just hiding treasure. She was hiding from him, from his family, and now he's found you. The professor's words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. As the weight of them settled on me, my phone rang, shrill and insistent. It was Mark. I let it go to voicemail, my heart a cold stone in my chest. A moment later, a text popped up. It wasn't from Mark. It was from an unknown number. My fingers trembled as I opened it. It was a single grainy photo, clearly taken with a zoom lens. It was a picture of my husband, Mark, getting out of his car, and standing beside him on the sidewalk, shaking his hand with a polished, predatory smile, was Alexei Volkov. The photograph on my phone screen felt like a punch to the gut. Mark and Alexei, shaking hands. My husband, who complained about money, who called my family home a shack, was meeting with the very man who was threatening me for its contents. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The timing of Alexei's arrival wasn't a coincidence. Mark's sudden, relentless pressure to sell the house wasn't just about a tech stock. He had somehow made contact with Alexei. He was trying to sell my grandmother's legacy out from under me. Betrayal, cold and sharp, cut deeper than any fear Alexei had inspired. "What is it, Clara?" Professor Sharma asked, seeing the blood drain from my face. I showed her the photo. "He's working with him," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "The realtor tomorrow. It's a lie. It's a pretense to get Alexei into the house." Professor Sharma's expression hardened. "Then we don't have until tomorrow. We have until they get to the house. We have to assume they're on their way there now." She stood up, her academic demeanor replaced by a steely resolve that reminded me, surprisingly, of my grandmother. "The last diary entry," she said, her mind working fast. "She's the only one who can keep the secret safe. Not the jewels, the secret. And it's connected to these letters. The jewels were a distraction, a magnificent, glittering misdirection." "But there are no letters," I insisted, my mind racing. "I searched the vault." "Think, Clara. Your grandmother was a brilliant woman who survived the fall of an empire. She hid the jewels behind a wall, a classic hiding place. Would she hide something even more important in the same spot?" The professor's eyes scanned my face, searching. She was a keeper of things. Where did she keep her most treasured possessions? The things she looked at every day? My mind flashed through the house. The mahogany sideboard with the candy dish, the lumpy armchair, the bookshelf. And then it hit me. A memory so vivid it was like I was a child again. My grandmother sitting in her armchair holding a heavy leather-bound book with a worn floral cover. It wasn't a book she read from. It was a scrapbook. Her scrapbook, I breathed. The one with all the pressed flowers. She kept it on the bottom shelf of the bookcase in the study. She'd told me it was her garden diary. "Go," Professor Sharma commanded. "Go now. I'll call a friend of mine, a curator at the University Museum who deals with sensitive historical acquisitions. He'll know what to do. He can be discreet. Don't go home. Don't answer your phone. Get the scrapbook and meet me back here." The drive back to the cottage was a blur of adrenaline and heartbreak. Every fond memory I had of Mark was now tainted, every complaint about money a lie, every push to sell a calculated betrayal. I pulled into the gravel driveway, my tires crunching loud in the eerie quiet. I used the back door, my heart hammering as I slipped inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it, the dusty corner I'd created looking flimsy and pathetic. I went straight to the bookshelf in the study, my eyes finding the familiar floral cover of the scrapbook. It was heavier than I remembered. I sat on the floor and opened it. The first few pages were just as I recalled. Brittle, yellowed paper, with carefully pressed roses and lavender, labeled with my grandmother's elegant script. But about halfway through, the pages felt different, thicker. I ran my finger along the edge of a pressed delphinium and felt a slit in the heavy paper. The pages had been hollowed out. Inside, nestled in a perfectly cut-out compartment, was a slim bundle of letters, tied with the same kind of faded silk ribbon as the diary. They were written on thin, almost translucent paper, covered in the same Cyrillic script. This was it. This was the secret. As I carefully lifted the letters, I heard it again, the crunch of tires on the driveway. But this time, it was 2 cars. Headlights swept across the study windows, casting long, dancing shadows. They were here. Mark and Alexei. There was no time to run. My eyes darted around the room, the fireplace. It was my only chance. With trembling hands, I took the sapphire necklace from my bag and laid it on top of the scrapbook. Then I knelt before the wardrobe. I pulled away the coat rack and the hat boxes and swung open the stone panel to the vault. I reached in, grabbed the diamond tiara, a fistful of brooches, and a heavy gold bracelet, and threw them onto the floor in front of the gaping black hole. I made it look like a panicked, interrupted robbery. Then I ran to the back of the house, to the small pantry, and squeezed myself into the cramped space behind a row of hanging coats, pulling the door almost shut, leaving only a sliver of a gap to see through. I held the scrapbook to my chest, its precious contents a heavy weight against my pounding heart. The front door opened. I heard Mark's voice, artificially jovial. "See? Just like I told you. She hasn't touched the place in years. We can start in the study." "Just open the door, Mark." Alexei's voice was cold, impatient. I heard them enter the study. There was a moment of silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath from Mark. "What the hell?" "It seems we are not the first to arrive," Alexei said, his voice dangerously calm. "She found it." "Clara?" Mark sounded confused, then angry. "That little... She was playing me the whole time. The sentimental act. It was all a lie." "She has her great-grandmother's spirit, it would seem," Alexei murmured. "A pity. Check the vault. See what she has left." I heard scraping, the sound of the jewels being gathered from the floor. "The necklace is gone," Mark said, his voice tight with fury. "The big sapphire one and the tiara. She took the best pieces. She's probably halfway to a pawn shop by now." "No," Alexei said thoughtfully. "This is not about money, not for her. It is about the letters. The letters of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, letters proving that the British Secret Intelligence Service was complicit in Rasputin's murder to keep Russia in the war. I could almost feel the weight of Professor Sharma's words. A dangerous piece of history. Those letters would be an embarrassment of monumental proportions. Powerful people have been hunting for them for a century. My family was charged with recovering them, and your father, Mark, was charged with watching her. He failed. I will not. My blood ran cold. Your father. Mark's father had been a diplomat who'd known my grandmother. It wasn't a coincidence. They had been watching us my whole life. My marriage wasn't a romance. It was an assignment. Forget the letters, Mark spat. There's still millions here, enough for us to disappear just like we planned. My plan has changed, Alexei said, his voice like chipping ice. She has made this complicated. Find her. The sentimental fool wouldn't have gone far. She's probably hiding somewhere on the property, clutching her precious mementos. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the darkness of the pantry. I heard their footsteps moving through the house, opening doors, calling my name with a mixture of false concern and menace. I waited. It felt like an eternity. Finally, I heard the front door slam and the sound of the cars driving away. I didn't move for a full 10 minutes. When I finally emerged, the house was silent and still. The jewels I had thrown on the floor were gone. The vault was empty. But they hadn't found what they were really looking for. I walked out of my grandmother's house for the last time, not with a fortune in jewels, but with something far more valuable: the truth. I drove back to Professor Sharma's, the scrapbook of letters on the seat beside me. Her friend, the museum curator, was already there. He handled the letters with a reverence that made me want to weep. They authenticated them, and the story that unfolded over the next few weeks was a quiet storm of diplomatic negotiations and hushed-up history. The letters were acquired by a private consortium, their contents secured. In exchange, a foundation was set up in my grandmother's name, Princess Yelena's, dedicated to preserving historical artifacts and aiding refugees, a life's work she would have cherished. I received a finder's fee that was more than enough to live comfortably, to be independent. The jewels Alexei had stolen were never recovered, but it didn't matter. They were never the real treasure. As for Mark, I filed for divorce the next day, citing irreconcilable differences. His lawyers tried to make a claim on the house, on the foundation's money, but with the evidence from Professor Sharma and the curator, his case crumbled. I never saw him or Alexei Volkov again. I imagine they are still out there, hunting for other lost treasures, two ghosts chasing the gilded phantoms of a dead empire. I kept my grandmother's house. I didn't sell the old shack. I had the roof repaired and the walls repainted. I spent my summers there tending her wild roses and sitting in her lumpy armchair, reading her stories. I finally understood that her fairy tales weren't just make-believe. They were warnings. They were lessons in survival. She taught me that the greatest treasures are not made of gold or diamonds, but of courage and secrets kept. She had been the custodian of a dangerous truth, and now I was the keeper of her legacy.